for another Sheriff of Sodium video. This week, President Donald Trump issued an executive order targeting the organizations that accredit institutions of higher learning. Specifically mentioned in the order are the Liaison Committee for Medical Education, or LCME, which accredits MD granting medical schools, and the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME, which accredits residency training programs. This is a big deal that threatens to shake up the medical training system in the United States, and the intent and impacts and implications of this executive order all deserve some scrutiny. So you know what that means. It's time to break it down, winners and losers style. Let's start with the obvious. Our first loser, the LCME and ACGME. You know, one does not simply open a medical school or a residency training program. You got to have permission to do that from the accrediting body. Or at least you have to have permission from the accrediting body if you actually want your medical students to be eligible to take out federal student loans, or if you want your residents to be eligible to get Medicare GME subsidies. The LCME and ACGME are quite literally the gatekeepers of medical training in the United States. Their decisions ultimately determine how many people will get trained and what the structure of their training will look like. They have an incredible amount of power and responsibility, and for decades, I think most people in medical education, myself included, regarded them as being essentially untouchable. Now they've been touched. The executive order directs the Attorney General and Secretary of Education to investigate the LCME and ACGME and remove their status as accrediting agencies. Because one does not simply accredit medical schools or residency programs either. The accreditors themselves have to be accredited and recognized by the Department of Education. If they lose that status, the LCME and ACGME would functionally cease to exist. Next, another loser, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The stated purpose of the executive order as it relates to medical accrediting agencies is to address unlawful discrimination related to DEI policies. The logic here seems to be that, because of the Supreme Court's decision in 2023 in the Students for Fair Admissions case, in which the court found that race-based affirmative action policies were impermissible in college admissions, that the LCME and ACGME are enabling or even perpetuating unlawful discrimination by including in their accreditation standards certain requirements for the institutions related to diversity. Notice, however, that this is my own conclusion because although the EO mentions unlawful discrimination and it targets the LCME and ACGME standards, it doesn't actually draw a very clear line between the two. Instead, for the LCME, the order specifically cites this passage from their accreditation standards in which they require medical schools to, quote, engage in ongoing, systematic, and focused recruitment and retention activities to achieve mission-appropriate diversity outcomes among its students, end quote. For the ACGME, the order says that their standards, quote, expect institutions to focus on implementing policies and procedures related to the recruitment and retention of individuals underrepresented in medicine, including racial and ethnic minority individuals, end quote. Now, obviously, the fact that this is occurring will not be surprising to anyone who's followed the news over the past several months. The very term DEI has become a political target onto anything to which it's been affixed, regardless of its intent or value. So what comes next? To make a prediction, I think it's important to closely read the order. Notice that the order directs the AG and Secretary of Education to investigate the LCME and ACGME, but it doesn't say that the focus of that investigation is to determine whether or not unlawful discrimination has occurred or whether or not federal law has been broken. Rather, there seems to be a foregone conclusion based upon the citations that I just provided that unlawful discrimination has occurred, and these agencies are directed to take appropriate action to terminate it. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the threat of removing federal recognition as official accrediting agencies would be a headshot to either of these organizations. To me, the real question is, what are the ACGME and LCME going to have to do to get out of hot water with this administration? Is that even going to be possible? I think the past several months have demonstrated that the targets of these executive orders have limited options. You can kiss the ring, like Columbia or many of the white shoe law firms that have been targeted by previous actions have, or you can lawyer up like Harvard or a handful of the other law firms. And my prediction is they'll kiss the ring. Because unlike Harvard or the law firms who are fighting back, the LCME and ACGME, they have no way of staying afloat if the government follows through on their threat. Accreditation is their only business. Without it, they have nothing. I mean, the ACGME has assets of over $100 million, but I honestly don't know how long they could stay afloat and fund an expensive, potentially prolonged legal battle if they end up losing their accreditation revenue. Now, the LCME is co-sponsored by the AAMC and AMA. The AMA has been notably silent throughout this administration. I think it's very clear that they don't want to get in the middle of a political battle and end up getting targeted themselves. But the AAMC may be willing to fight over this because, to be honest, I think the AAMC leadership knows that they're already in the administration's crosshairs, and they are very, very likely to be directly targeted in one way or another by future executive orders, so they're going to have to dig in their feet somewhere. But again, my prediction is that the ACGME, at least, is going to try to make a deal. So what's it going to take to get out from under the guillotine? Again, if previous executive orders give us any guidance, and I think they do, it simply will not be enough to just say, oh, sorry, sir, we'll change the standards that you found objectionable. My guess is that the administration will demand additional concessions. My guess is that they'll demand that the ACGME actually become an anti-DEI police agency of sorts. And they'll have to keep their eyes open during their accreditation surveys for anyone that might be a little too interested in having a diverse or equitable or inclusive workplace, and then use their power to deny or even remove accreditation from programs whose institutions aren't towing the administration's line on DEI. Next, a winner, MCAT and USMLE scores. Because if we are entering a world in which accrediting agencies will not only have to abstain from requiring DEI, but will also be encouraged to monitor institutions' admissions policies and deny accreditation to those whose policies do not appear to be merit-based, according to the ruling party, then it's going to behoove institutions to have a system that can withstand the scrutiny of the anti-DEI police. And what better way is there to do that than by using scores? Obviously, MCAT and USMLE scores are already very important in selection decisions, but I think that they're going to acquire even more primacy as a way for school and program officials to insulate themselves against any claim that they're participating in unlawful discrimination. Next, a push, COCA. Conspicuously missing from the text of the order was any mention of the Commission for Osteopathic College Accreditation, or COCA, which accredits U.S. DO granting medical schools. Is that just an oversight? I mean, DO leaders will be the first to tell you that their existence is often overlooked by policymakers, even though DO physicians make up around 10% of practicing physicians currently, and given the rapid growth in DO schools, that figure will rise rapidly over the decades to come. But the funny thing is, after describing the role of the LCME in accrediting MD granting schools, the text of the order then specifically cites how the ACGME is, quote, the sole accreditor for both allopathic and osteopathic medical residency and fellowship programs, end quote. So there was at least some consideration of osteopathic medicine by at least someone who was involved in drafting this executive order. So I don't think COCA is going to stay a winner for long. I've actually written before about how COCA's accreditation standards, they align very closely with those from the LCME. I mean, these days there are really very few structural differences between accrediting an MD or a DO granting medical school. And several of COCA's accreditation standards make specific reference to DEI. So for now, COCA is safe, but I have a feeling they won't be for long. Next up, a winner, do no harm. Now, I don't have any inside information on this, but I strongly suspect that this executive order would not have been issued without the efforts of Dr. Stanley Goldfarb and his organization, Do No Harm Medicine. Over the past several years, Dr. Goldfarb has transformed from a former Ivy League medical school dean best known for his old man yells at cloud type of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal to being the leader of a complex and ideologically aggressive organization that's staffed by researchers and strategists and analysts and has been primarily focused on eliminating DEI initiatives from medical education. And that organization is honestly now feared by many otherwise hard to rattle institutional and organizational leaders. And I happened to notice that on March 18th, 2025, Do No Harm issued a 12-page report called Unethical Expectations: How Accreditors Inject Identity Politics into Medical and Healthcare Education. And then, 1 month later, we get this executive order. I wouldn't be surprised at all to learn that Dr. Goldfarb or Do No Harm directly advised the administration on this EO, and even if they didn't, I think that their work has been intellectually persuasive for those who did. Next, a push: hospital GME funding. In 2023, Medicare provided somewhere in the neighborhood of $16 billion to hospitals to support resident training. But in order to be eligible for those DGME and IME payments, the hospital's residency programs, by statute, they have to be accredited. So what happens if the ACGME is no longer recognized as an official accrediting body? What happens then? Is Congress going to amend legislation to keep the funds flowing? Or will the government let the faucet stop and chaos ensue? In normal times, I would expect the former, but this political administration has shown an unprecedented willingness to use maximal leverage and to allow things to break. And potentially, the opportunity to create pain for academic medical centers might actually be perceived as a side benefit. I think that the fact that the ACGME is now in the president's crosshairs has got to make many hospital CEOs very nervous too. Next, a loser: financial aid officers. Because I think that same anxiety is probably felt by financial aid officers too. Remember, what enables medical students to take out ungodly amounts of debt to finance their medical school education is the fact that their school is accredited. No accreditation, no federal student loans. So the LCME disappears. Are students still going to be able to finance their education? I don't think they will unless we have some kind of stopgap solution devised. Next, a winner: accreditation entrepreneurs. If the LCME and ACGME do lose their federal recognition and cease functioning, it'll create chaos. Not only for GME funding and student loans, but for all sorts of things that depend on a doctor being enrolled in or having completed training in an accredited program. Those are things ranging from USMLE registration to state licensure. So do we really want that degree of chaos? I mean, even in this time of deep political division, surely Americans can rally around the idea that having some kind of consistent standard for training doctors is probably a good thing to insist upon in a functioning society. So who can rescue us from this looming chaos? Why, accreditation entrepreneurs, that's who. You see, there's another part of the executive order that expressly directs the Secretary of Education to resume recognizing new accreditors. So what that means is that right now, there's an amazing, maybe once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for some entrepreneur to snatch up a piece of the very lucrative accreditation game. And here, I think it's relevant to mention that hospital and medical school accreditation, they're such high-stakes endeavors that we already have a legion of boutique consultants who travel around the country and charge five-figure fees to help your school or hospital successfully navigate the accreditation process. These folks know the game, and they've already demonstrated their entrepreneurial spirit through their eagerness to leave the dean's office or academic medicine and stake their claim as consultants. So my guess is that some of these folks will be pitching venture capitalists this week. And that brings us to this: a push: accreditation competition. It should be clear that the market for accrediting agencies is being opened up, but what's less clear to me is whether that's going to be a good thing. Now, if you're a long-term viewer of this channel, you know that one thing that I've been consistently critical of is a coercive monopoly, an organization that positions themselves as being the only provider of a required service and then commands a captive market to pay for that service at whatever price they want to charge. And I'll be the first to tell you also that some of the current accreditation standards are onerous and unhelpful. I don't really think we need LCME surveyors counting pieces of furniture in the student lounge or auditing paper trails for every minuscule professional decision about the curriculum. And the ACGME's requirements for resident wellness, although nice in spirit, they probably haven't done a lick of good. mean, residents still burn out. They just burn out now after they've completed their sleep and fatigue mitigation modules and resilience training. But even then, I still have some real concerns about opening up this market. The first is this. I mean, suppose you're a hotshot former consultant, entrepreneur who's breaking into the accreditation market. How are you going to convince institutions to use your accreditation service? Well, I'll tell you how you're not going to convince them. You're not going to convince them by being a stickler about things and denying them accreditation. You're going to have to be cheaper or faster, or better yet, offer as close to a 100% success rate as you possibly can while keeping a straight face in order for your new company to earn market share or in this new wild west of accreditation services. So is that really what we want? I mean, do we want schools and hospitals shopping for the lowest bidder on accreditation services? I mean, if you were a school official, would you want to hold yourself to a higher standard when you could just spare yourself a lot of trouble by going to Wild Willie's one-stop easy accreditation shop? So in a world with multiple accreditation players that now have to compete on price, I think we're going to see an increasingly strong incentive to grow the size of the accreditation market by allowing more and more marginal institutions to become accredited. Can I have a medical school in this strip mall? Could I create a residency program in this doctor's office? Well, I don't see why not, as long as it doesn't have anything to do with DEI. You got to remember the business model here. Schools and hospitals pay the accrediting agency. It's a model that is guaranteed to result in regulatory capture, and it's only going to be accelerated by approving new accrediting agencies whose initial reason for being is an expressed willingness to uphold the party in power's preferred policies. But my second concern is that, from time to time, there are advantages to having a single accreditation body. If you're the only game in town, it becomes a lot easier to be the bad guy. And although I have my quibbles with the LCME and ACGME, I'm going to put it to you that it is a true statement that not all medical schools and residency programs are good. Not all medical schools and residency programs act in the best interest of their trainees. Some of these institutions require policing, and not universally, but from time to time, the LCGME and ACGME have functioned effectively in that role. If you know that losing your accreditation with one agency is going to ruin your institution, you're a little bit more careful than if you know that losing your accreditation with one agency isn't a death sentence, because you can always try again with somebody new who would be oh so happy to pick up a new customer. And in that case, it may be tempting, and actually it may be a dominant strategy to push the envelope and see what you can get away with. Now, I do think it's true that having more players in the market offers the possibility of faster innovation, and that could be a good thing. But having more players in the market will also make it nearly impossible to impose big, hard-to-swallow changes. If you want an example of what I'm talking about, how about the 80-hour work week? I mean, you don't have to look hard to find attendings who think today's trainees are soft, because back when they trained, their hours were unlimited. But if you're somebody who didn't live through that transition, it's hard to describe just how angry some hospitals were about this. So do you think that the ACGME could have shoved that down their throat if hospitals had an alternative that they could have turned to? I mean, do you think the ACGME would have even tried? My point is, there are major trade-offs here, and that's why I'm calling it a push. Next, a loser: physician self-governance. Regardless of how you feel about the LCME or ACGME, I do think there was something to be said for the fact that it was doctors and educators and others who had some experience in medical training who were making these standard-setting decisions, not politicians. And honestly, I think you should mourn this loss of physician self-governance, even if you believe that these organizations were impermissibly pushing DEI. If you're a doctor, I don't think we want all mechanisms of physician self-governance to be beholden to the political whims of the day. Because once we as a profession concede or have that power taken from us by government, it's difficult, if not impossible, to ever get it back. And last, the big winner: power. Now, if you've listened to me very much, you know that I try to stay away from politics because, number one, I know you don't come here for that. And number two, it's not really my area of expertise. And in general, I try to stay in my lane. That said, I'm guessing you can probably discern what my opinions are about this political action. If not, I'll tell you. I think it's bad. I mean, at times, I've probably been as vocal of a critic of the LCME and ACGME as anyone. Believe me, they could stand to have their wings clipped. But as a matter of public policy, I simply do not think we are going to make medical training better or improve care for patients by blowing up our standard setters, or potentially even worse, turning them into puppets of the ruling party. We're just not. Now, some of you are going to disagree with me and say, but DEI, the schools and institutions are overrun by DEI ideology, and they're so corrupt, and having the president step in is the only option available to effect change. So the ends justify the means. And if you say that, I mean, that's fine. I think it's a fallacious argument for multiple reasons, but if you choose to make it in the comments below, I'm probably not going to spend time countering you because, and this is really the important part here, this isn't really about DEI. DEI may be the MacGuffin that got us this particular executive order, but what we are really seeing here is a masterclass in behavioral economics and the consolidation of power. And if you don't know already, let me explain what I mean. Back in the 1970s, these economists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they did a little experiment. And what they found ended up being one of the most important and robust findings in behavioral economics and ultimately earned a Nobel Prize. So basically, here's what they did. They asked a group of people, would you rather win $500 or have $500 taken from you? And you might think that people would be indifferent, but they're not. Human beings are loss averse. So actually, when they quantified it, the psychological impact of losing something was around 2 or 2.5 times more powerful than the impact of gaining that same thing. So, in other words, you'd have to be given $1,000 or $1,250 in order to feel the same about a gain as you would about a $500 loss. We think and talk a lot about improper influence peddling in society. I mean, if you get an office lunch from a pharmaceutical representative, you got to put it at the front of your talk so that everybody knows that you might have been improperly influenced by the sandwiches that they brought you. But what this president recognizes, which I think other presidents have not, or if they have, they haven't had the will to follow that recognition through to its fullest extent. But what this president recognizes is that it's far more effective to take away something that someone already has than it is to give them something. And I think that's even more true when you take away something that a person or an organization never even considered could be taken away from them. And I would bet you cash money that if we looked back at the LCME and ACGME strategic plans from a couple of years ago, I can guarantee you their SWOT analyses did not include anything about a potential threat of an executive order stripping away their very authority to be an accreditor. And the same thing is true for Harvard and Columbia and their NIH grants, or the white shoe law firms and their ability to physically enter federal buildings. Now, maybe some of these actions are going to get clawed back by the courts. I mean, maybe even this one does, because there's a case to be made that this EO is protectual and may ultimately end up violating due process. But really, in terms of consolidating power, that doesn't matter. Because, Kahneman had this other experiment where he identified something that he called the endowment effect. And basically, I'll be brief, but once somebody perceives something as being theirs, even if only briefly, they value it more. So if you remove it and offer it to give it back, you amplify its value and you create this sense of urgency and dependency. These organizations that used to take their funding or their very existence for granted, now they perceive their funding or stability to be uncertain. And when they perceive their institutional stability or funding as precarious and uncertain, it makes them even more susceptible to even mild or subtle political pressure in the future. And there's something else too. When people perceive that their freedoms or rights are being taken away, sometimes they experience psychological reactance, which is a motivational state that is directed at restoring their lost freedom. But the kicker is, if the perceived power to restore the freedom is held by a central authority, then the people sometimes trick themselves into thinking that they're not being coerced. They reframe their compliance as actually being a righteous action. They're just trying to get back what was rightfully theirs all along. So, in my opinion, this order will certainly have impacts on DEI. And for some people, like Dr. Goldfarb, it probably is about DEI. But for the people at the very top, I don't think that's what it's about at all. I think it's the same thing that we've seen with other EOs, or with the persistent threats to tariff this or tariff that, or it's a way of threatening different sections of the U.S. economy. And it's all just an exercise in leverage and the consolidation of power. And unfortunately, I think that's the big winner in this story. And for now, that's all I've got. Once again, thanks for listening.